Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Chittum, and welcome to my talk on the Salesforce CLI, solving everyday problems with the Salesforce CLI. Who wants to solve some problems with me today? Everybody. Yay, that's why I came, Peter. Yay. So my name is Peter Chittum. I am a developer evangelist here at Salesforce. I am based in the UK, even though I don't sound like it. And yeah. Here's my talk. I've actually been doing a talk that's sort of a precursor to this that I'll mention in a moment here. I may make forward-looking statements. If I do, don't use any of that information to purchase any Salesforce products. Make all of your purchasing decisions based on features that are currently generally available. And before I even start, a quick thank you to Manchester, England, who hosted me recently at a developer group. I was actually a joint developer user group. Because when you're a developer evangelist and you want to think about everyday problems, you realize that your everyday problems aren't necessarily your customers' everyday problems. So I wanted to go and hear from you, the people actually using Salesforce in anger on a daily basis, and hopefully get some real everyday problems that would be meaningful to you folks at Dreamforce. So I went and visited. They helped me workshop and brainstorm some ideas. And this talk actually has some of them incorporated into it, which is exciting. Anyone here asking this question? What is a command line interface, a CLI? Okay. No? That's good. Well, just wanted to make sure we started off on the same foot. Salesforce DX. There's a lot of talks this week about Salesforce DX. This is our next generation set of tools for doing modern application development. And if you read the abstract, I kind of talk about this. Salesforce DX is an umbrella term for a lot of things. One of those things is the Salesforce CLI. And so that's kind of why I wanted to spend some time talking just on the Salesforce CLI, because when I talk about the command line interface for Salesforce, I often get something like this. You know, it's like, well, I'd use the CLI, but I'm not using Salesforce DX, right? The reality is you don't need to. You don't need to use anything else that's part of Salesforce DX, and you can still start using the command line interface. In fact, I think it's the most versatile tool and the most exciting tool in some ways, because it's a foundational tool for a lot of other things, as far as all the other things that have come from the DX features and products and functionality and APIs. I love the command line interface because it gives me a whole new way to interact with Salesforce in a way I've never really been able to be productive before. And so, yeah, there's all these things about Salesforce DX, sure, but it's really not a set menu. Right? You can pick and choose the things that you want to use. And so that's what we're picking and choosing today, is the command line interface. So a few things about the command line interface. This isn't everything about it, but it's a few things that I wanted to make sure we talked about. Really, I think of it as a way to connect my laptop to my org, fundamentally. It accesses a lot of the common APIs in your Salesforce environment, so it makes it super easy to get to those. It's universal. It'll work on Windows or Mac or Linux. And even cooler, you can write custom plugins. And I'm not going to go there today, but I just want you to be aware that you can do that. And there's a very easy, effective framework to bootstrap you into creating new custom plugins for the command line interface. All right. So let me get a breakdown of the room. Who here is a coder? Almost everybody's raising their hands. Who here is not? Did I attract any of you? Okay, cool, that's great. For those of you who aren't, you might be thinking, like, why the command line? You know, why am I typing all of this stuff? And the reality is, command line interfaces have been around since the 1960s. And I can't think of any other tool that's part of modern software development that has been around since the 1960s, actually. So there must be a reason why it's still around. And that is because it is really effective. If you're going to do things like repetitive tasks, it's very easy to go back and redo the thing you just did, or just redo the thing you just did 5 commands ago, or redo the thing you just did with a little bit of a change to it. It's very flexible. It's really good at combining multiple tasks into one big one. And really, it's great for both coders and non-coders. And I know a lot of people who I talk to who aren't coders, who are maybe admins, look at me and say, are you serious? I don't think I can do that. Well, that's what I've been talking about for 18 months. So this is the inception moment where Peter talks about his other talk. Because it is available. The best recording, I would say, is from Trailhead DX this year. So if you want to go, if you're not sure about using a command line, and I've talked to both developers and admins who are tentative about adopting a command line interface. If that's you, go and check out my talk. Hopefully, it will get you over that first few steps of starting to use a command line. So what can the Salesforce command line do? This is some of the things, the sort of broader features or the broader surface area of the API that it touches. Of course, it can access things like Apex, Visualforce, Lightning Components. But then, apart from development, there's some really interesting things you can get out of your org around limits, and you can authorize multiple users against an org and access them really quickly. Information about your org itself. Data management is a good one. And the whole point of this talk was to think about what this command line interface did, and then think beyond that and try to come up with, based on what I can do with the command line without any custom plugins or anything like that, what are some problems I could solve? Okay? All right. So who here has not used the command line today? Okay, so everybody, yeah, asking who hasn't done something. Sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to raise my hand. But there's a few of you who haven't. So let me break down what the command line looks like. So first of all, there's the universal binary that is the Salesforce command line, and that's just SFDX. After that, there'll be an action that you're going to take. And this is actually invoking a plugin, because underneath this, there is a command line framework that we're using that's called Oakcliff. So this is the core plugin that interfaces with the Salesforce core functionality. Now, let me ask this. If you read force data record get as a command, who here is still confused as to what this command is doing? Right? Most of these commands are very intuitive as far as how they're named, so you don't need to be guessing about what they do. Now, if I needed to get a record from Salesforce, what are some of the things I'm also going to need to tell the command line? This is the audience participation part. I'm going to need to tell it, like, which record, yeah? Which org, absolutely. Which object. This will actually get all of the fields from that particular record. But just one record, that's kind of the thing. And so those are the parameters that we specify. So every command will have these three things in common. There will be the binary, SFDX, the action to take, and then the parameters that you specify that will tell Salesforce what to do with that command when it gets it. Okay? And that's pretty much all we need before we jump into the demo. So let's jump into the demo. Oh, actually, I kind of skipped away from this slide. So let me just show it really quickly. A lot of the shell scripts and things that I'm actually going to be using are available in this GitHub repo. So you can go take a look at that. It's pretty rudimentary right now, and I have much bigger plans. I actually had much bigger plans to have more stuff ready for this. But, Dreamforce preparation can kind of get in the way sometimes. So I had to leave some of the things off the table I wanted in there. Particularly, I did want to have some examples of either PowerShell or CMD scripts that would work with Windows. Just as a poll really quickly, who here uses Windows primarily as their operating system? So that's at least half. Who here Mac? Yeah, so that's pretty much half and half. So, I want you to be sure to understand that the way that the Salesforce DX command line itself works is the same. It's not going to change whether you're using Windows, whether you're using Mac. All right, now let's go and take a look. So the first thing is I want to get a sense for the environment that I'm in right now. So let me clear that. There we go. SFDX force org list. So I can actually go, and is that big enough? I want that a little bigger, I think, don't I? Yeah. Better? Yeah? All right, good. These are all the orgs that I've already authorized for Salesforce DX to use on this particular laptop. Now, here's the thing. Who here is using the Salesforce mobile app? A few of you, right? When you log back into the mobile app, do you have to enter in your username and password all over again? No, right? It remembers your authorization information. That's exactly what we're looking at here, is saved authorization to different Salesforce orgs. And so I can invoke them either by simply specifying a username or by specifying the alias over here, which is much handier and cleaner. So most of the time, I'm going to use an alias when I go and authorize against an org or when I create a new org. Okay? You can see they're also separated. On the top, these are all different types of orgs, like Enterprise Edition orgs, sandboxes, trial orgs, Trailhead playgrounds, et cetera. Developer Edition orgs mostly, actually. And then down below, there's one that's actually a Scratch org, one of these new temporary orgs that's also part of the Salesforce DX toolchain. Okay? Yeah, okay, you can still see that. And you can see that this one here is marked with a D, and this one here is marked with a U, okay? So basically, those are different versions of the org. And let me just see, actually, I'm in the wrong tab, so I'm going to switch for a second here. There we go. There we go. We'll let that kick off one more time. So those markings are defaults. And what that means is in this environment, there's a dev hub that manages the Scratch org licenses. And then there can be one default Scratch org that I can connect to. And the nice thing about the default Scratch org means that when I try and connect to it, I don't have to explicitly state it. It's defaulted for just this project. Okay? All right. So the first thing I want to do, actually, is create an org to work with. And the way that I could do that is by creating the org, and then I have to upload some metadata, and then I have to assign a permission set, and then I have to upload some data. So there's actually a lot of stuff to do, potentially. And why not make that a little bit easier? So that's actually the first little thing I wanted to show, which is creating an org, but doing it with a shell script. So again, I'll make that a little bigger. And you can see there that I've got 4 commands that I'm going to execute. There's a 5th one that's commented out that would ostensibly launch the org in a browser window if I wanted to. But since I'm going to do this and go away and come back, I don't want it to interrupt my other flow. So I've commented that particular line out. Incidentally, if you take the latest version of the Dreamhouse demo app, this script is in there in a slightly different format. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And so let's see what directory I'm in. So scripts, org init. And then I need to give it an alias. I'm going to call it df18 scratch. And then which, what's the other parameter? Oh, number of days I want it active for, so 30 days. And you can go between 1 and 30 days on Scratch orgs as far as the duration. And off that goes. And I'll leave that to do its thing. In the meantime, I'm going to use a different org for some other things. And that one I would need to connect to. So again, let me make that a little bigger. And in this instance, I want to connect to an existing Developer Edition org, because I would definitely want to show you that it's not just Scratch orgs that the command line works with. So here, I'm going to do sfdx force auth web, and I actually have an auto-populate script that Wade Wagner wrote working with my shell right here. So I didn't have to type the whole thing out. And again, I'm going to give this one an alias, so -a, and I sometimes pick like names from foreign languages for names of orgs, and Blickstar is just lightning in Swedish. Don't ask me how I came up with that. So I need to sign on. Here we go. That one right there. And then when I complete the sign on, the token is going to get handed back to the host environment that launched it. And it's going to come back and say, all right, you're authorized. You can now access this org as you wish. And you can close the browser if you don't need it. So this is how we go and authorize an existing org. And now I've got two orgs to work with. I've got my Scratch org. I've got my Developer Edition org. Now going back to the Scratch org, you can see that we've populated some data. And one really common thing that I think everybody relates to is working with data. Salesforce is very much a data-oriented platform. And so I'm actually going to do a query here, sfdx force data sockle query. And the query I want is select ID status name from property. So that's one of those objects that came in with the project, and we'll take a look at that. Now let's say I needed to do a little bit of data management in my org where I needed to update all of those status values, and I needed to get them to be available all at once. How would you do that normally in Salesforce? You could use a developer console, that's one way. But let's say it was 500 and not 12. Data loader, sure. Workbench maybe, export a report. Yeah, so basically we're talking export, twiddle the data around, and then import it back in, right? When I talk to admins about this, oftentimes what they'll say is, well, export and then use Excel and then import again. But what if I could export to CSV right here, which I can, okay? And then instead of just exporting to CSV, what if I were to take that output and I'm going to use a utility called sed. Anyone heard of sed? So sed is stream editor, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to edit the data stream of this, this command line command as it's writing it to a file eventually, okay? So sed, and we'll do a substitution. We're going to look for two commas. And instead we'll do comma available, comma. And now let's see what we get out from that. Okay, cool. And now let's go ahead and write that to a CSV. So data/updates.csv. Only I'm not going to stop there because I'm already using the command line and it has data management tools. So why don't I just import it again, right? So $& means provided there are no errors, proceed. And we'll do sfdx force data bulk upsert. And we need to give it some information. So first of all, what's the ID field? So upsert, remember, could be an external ID. I need to tell it which S object type, and that's property C. And then I also need to tell it which file it's going to go to, go from, rather, which is the data updates.csv. And I'm also going to do a wait command because the bulk API is asynchronous. If I just shoot the command off there, it's going to then come back and say, OK, we're done. And then I have to go back and ask for the status. And this way, the command line will actually wait for the status. And once that's all done, it shouldn't take 10 minutes, even though I've told it to wait that long. It should be pretty quick. Usually, it's a matter of seconds when I do this demo. And there we go. So it says it's done. If I look really carefully, it says nothing failed. So that's always a good sign. And if I go and repeat my initial query, then I should see that I have my, my available status set on all of those records. Now, it's a little bit of a learning curve to learn all of that stuff, I admit. But if you think about it, this is way faster than export, open up in Excel, make some changes, and then import again, particularly, again, like if you have 500 records. So this is an example of that flexibility and the kind of things that you can do where you can sort of blend together all these different commands on the command line. All right. Now, this is a fairly, so I will take questions at the end. This is a fairly complex piece of data manipulation. There is another command that allows you to work with just one record. And let me clear that. That particular command is sfdx force data record update. Now, I already showed you record get, and very similarly, we need to provide the kind of information that you would expect for an update. What's the record? What's the object? What's the org? What are the fields to update? Right? So those all need to go into this command as well. But that's a lot of stuff to type. So of course, I wrote a script. So if I go here and, so if I go to cd, this one is users, I believe. I have these two scripts here, sfuser_deactivate.sh and sfuser_info.sh. And so let's say, again, I'm not logged into Salesforce, and I'm told that I need to quickly deactivate a user, right? Essentially, that is just a data update. That's a record update, right? So it's a really good example, I think, of what you could package into a script. And let's go take a look at it really quickly. That is that one. That's the one we want. All right. So this is the sfuser_deactivate.sh, and I'm going to just collapse that a little bit there. Basically, I take in two parameters. I'm going to take in the username, and I'm going to take in the org that I want to execute this. In other words, what's the admin user that I've saved in my alias, right? And if I get the right number of parameters, the admin user will be assigned the second parameter, and then the username that I want to deactivate will be the first parameter. And you can see that each of those variables in my script is just one part of the command. So there's the sfdx force data record update, and then I've got the different parameters, and then there's where I actually run the command. So going back, we can do /sfuser. And then the user I decided to deactivate is John at lab. Where is it? Practice. And that's in this Blickstar org that I just connected to. So we'll go ahead and do that. And because it's running another command line tool, I made sure I spat out what was the actual command I'm going to invoke, because I think that's pretty good feedback to give your user if they're executing it. And there we go. So it just says that the record was updated, but I can use that other command that I had. So sfuser_info, and again, John at lab.practice. And this is in Blickstar. And I'm not, there's a lot of user fields. So I'm just going to pull out a few fields to let me know that I got the data back that I wanted to. So if I do -i active, then I should just see the is active and probably a couple of other fields come back. There we go. So is active is null, tells me that that user has been deactivated, in fact. Okay? So far we have some data management, and really I've actually kind of tried to focus on some admin tasks just to show that using the command line isn't just for developers, it's really for any user that manages the org, whether they're a coder or not. But let's look at a couple of other things where you can inspect some information about your org. The first one I wanted to take a look at is limits. And one of the commands that I think is really powerful is that you can actually see your current limits in your org just by typing a single command. So if I do sfdx, that won't work, sfdx force limits API display, again, I'll have to specify the org I'm in, and then it's just going to spit all of those out. And that's fine. But it's potentially a lot to look through, and maybe I just want to occasionally check on my daily API limits, the ones that burn down over the course of a day, right? So again, I created a script. Actually, I created several, because using the same command I used earlier, grep, you can actually parse out different bits of the log, or the limits, based on what you want to do. So for instance, one is the concurrent limits, daily limits, data limits, hourly limits. So for instance, if I wanted to see the current daily limits, I could do sf daily, And then it's just going to run the same command. It's just using grep to pull out a few of the limits that are pertinent to daily limits. Of course, this may not be great because you might just see all of a sudden it's dipped really low, and you don't have any sense for the history of that. So the next thing I thought was, well, why don't I schedule this? And it's a daily limit, so if I run it once an hour, that's really only 12 API calls in the course of a day. But I can at least get some intelligence as to when the limits started to go south, if it's consistent over the course of the day or if it happens at a peak. So this is where are you? There we go. This is where I came up with this. Now, I'm going to keep it small. And you can see here that on the left-hand side, I'm actually running every 10 minutes, I'm getting all the limits that are hourly, so I can see the burn down over the course of the hour. And every hour, I'm running the daily limit, so I can see the burn down over the course of the day of those ones. And all I'm doing is just basically opening up a tail and following it, and then it just spits out the log as it's written from the log commands. The great news is that every operating system has a scheduler. This is a Mac, so I'm using the launchd scheduler. If it's Linux, you could be using cron, and Windows has Windows Scheduler as well. So this will work no matter which operating system you're working in. The one thing that I would just be sure is if you're going to do this on your personal laptop, that you keep it to a certain amount, right? And then also make sure that whatever you're doing will relaunch when you turn off and you turn back on again. Obviously, this isn't a server in a rack somewhere. It is my personal laptop. All right. So who here came expecting to, or hoping to see some Apex stuff? Nobody? Yeah, 1, 2 people. So I wanted to do a few Apex things. The main one that I think is interesting is there is a command that allows you to tail the debug log. And so what that means is you can run the command, and as the debug log is output on the server, we can receive it in the command line, and then we can write it to a file. And I love this when I'm developing now. All right, so I've got a whole bunch of stuff up here. I'm going to clear that, and clear that, and clear that. OK. And let's see. There we go. We'll make that a little bit bigger. So SFDX, force, apex, log, tail. If you're perceptive, you'll notice I am in a different directory. This is actually just a clone of the same environment that I was showing earlier that I created the Scratch org. So I'm doing this in a Scratch org, but this would work just as well in any org, like a sandbox, for instance. Okay. All right, so tail, and I do have a default username. This is a Salesforce DX project, so I don't need to explicitly specify that. I should just be able to go. And then if I come up here, this is where I'm going to try and run my API calls. I've got a trigger that I'm troubleshooting. And we'll go here and do SFDX force data record create, and let's go and find the right one. That should be it right there. That's part of the reason why I kept an existing org for this, is because I had user IDs, I had record IDs. Now, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, the red is telling me that there was an error. And in fact, that actually is my validation error from my trigger. Duplicate user cannot favorite the same property twice. This is the Dreamhouse app, right? But the reality is, this is a lot to sift through. Right? And this is a pretty simple log file. So this kind of came to me where I was like, well, what if I did something a little bit different? And I'm going to run the tail again, but I'm going to write it to a log file. And it's going to be small, so trust me, that's what I'm doing. So SFDX, force, apex, log tail. And then I'm going to write to logs. Debug.log. OK, so that's open up the tail. And now, instead of spitting it out to the console, I'm going to see it come out into a log file. So here, in this one, rather than watch the tail itself, I'm going to watch the log file. OK, this gets a little bit, talk about inception, all right? So ftip force, apex, log tail. Oh, no, actually I don't want to do that. I want to do tail minus f. All right, tail minus f logs debug log. Okay, and this will give me the ability to watch that whole log, but at the same time, I could also watch just parts of the log. And again, this is where grep is really helpful. So tail minus f, and here I'm grepping for just the log messages that are variable assignment. Okay, so anytime a variable gets assigned in Apex now, that's going to show up on the left-hand window. Let's hit enter so that it's running. And now, if I repeat attempting to create that record, I'm getting the error. On the left side, I get the whole log again, but on the right, now I'm just seeing the variable assignments. And the reason why I'm worried about my validation failure right now is that it's a duplicate failure. But I know that my database is empty. If I were to go and query that object right now, there's nothing in there. So now that I can see the variable assignments, what I start to find is that right here, that ID, which I know came from the database because that's what that variable is the same as that ID, which came from the trigger. So somehow, I'm actually getting some data from the database that is also in the trigger, which tells me that I may be accessing the data at the wrong time, right? So going back to my code, I'm going to go this way rather. All right. What I can find is that over here, actually, this should be, yeah. That's interesting. That should actually be before insert. All right. So over here, oh no, that's right. Yeah. So it's after insert right now, but this trigger was written with the logic for a before insert, right? So that would explain why, at a time when my database is actually empty, the trigger is still coming back with something in the database because I'm in the after cycle, right? So knowing that now, I can switch that to before, and I'll save that. And then let's go ahead and push that up to my Scratch org. And with it so big, it can be a little bit hard to tell what's going on, but eventually it says it successfully ran. And now if I repeat the create function from the command line, it should come back. It came back red. All right, that's interesting. So before insert, that's the right org. And that is the right org. So that, so let's try this. SFDX, force. Yeah, I think I have an old record in there, I bet. I think it's the one thing I didn't clean out. In any case, the point still stands that I do have some nice log messages over here, and it does let me get to the bottom of what's going on. And the nice thing about it is I don't have 50 bajillion debug log messages scattered around my code. I just have the tail open, and I can just watch those variable assignments. And so what I'm finding is I'm using a lot less system.debugs than I might have before when I'm trying to just chase something down. Now, that being said, there is the Apex replay debugger that's coming soon, generally available, that will also work in any org for free. So I think when we get to that point, I'm not sure how useful this is, but I think it's kind of a fun use case. And I do sort of like getting that instant feedback of what's going on. And I would guess I'd still probably use this. It's just if I had something really troubling, then I'd start to use the replay debugger once that comes down the pike. All right. The last thing that I just wanted to show, because I've got about 5 more minutes, and this should be quick. Yeah, actually right here. I've started to consider Apex to be almost a way to run scripts in my orgs. To be specific, my development orgs. Because of the Apex execute command, I can actually write a little bit of Apex, not have it in a class, and just execute it whenever I want to. So for instance, in this demo environment, when I want to reset the available value in that property, it's hard to do with a CSV because Right now, when I do the bulk import, it sees that empty value and it doesn't null it out. On the other hand, if I null it out in Apex, it works just fine. So this is my reset script, actually, for that available property value in this org. So that's the last thing I'll leave you with, which is there's a lot of data management things that you might need to do in your development environment. And there are some pretty decent data management features of the command line. But occasionally what I've found is that I can't quite do what I want using the command line directly, but I can in Apex. And it's a great sort of like last resort effort to actually get something done in that org. OK? All right. So let's go back to the slides. All right. So really quickly, just to recap, we talked about working with orgs, listing stuff about orgs, creating scratch orgs, connecting orgs, understanding org limits. We worked with some data. And what I love about data is so much about what happens in Salesforce is about data, even some of the admin tasks. So working with data isn't just working with data. Sometimes it's enabling yourself to do admin tasks. And then finally, a few things with Apex about tailing the log, and then also executing Apex directly from your file system. Now, there were a bunch of other things that group from Manchester gave me as ideas. One, actually, that I think it's probably the next thing I'm going to do, which is Sandbox Refresh. Sandbox Refresh is just an update on the Sandbox info object using the tooling API. And I've already showed you how to use the command line to update a record. So to me, that's going to be trivial to make that happen. But there's some other things I think that are interesting. One person wanted to mass delete reports. So they had hundreds of reports they wanted to get rid of. So that's something I'm probably going to take a look at. And then mass email changes to Sandbox users is another one. And again, I've showed you how to do some data management. I don't think that's going to be that hard to make happen. What may be a bit more difficult is to make it super automated. So that's something to explore a little bit further. Now, I only have 2 minutes. If there's any burning questions, maybe I'll take like one question. And if you have a question, please come to the mic. Yes. 2 minutes. Yep.
You got tab completion on the CLI?
Yeah, so there are 2 projects. I believe they're under Wade Wagner's personal GitHub account. Wade is the head of product for all the Salesforce DX features. So just check there. And there's tab completion for Bash and for Z Shell. I'm using Z Shell.
Thanks.
Cool. I only have 1 minute and 40 seconds left, so really quickly, just to stay on time. There's a ton of features in Salesforce DX besides the command line. Use the command line today. Figure out which other features to use in the future, because there are some great ways to, I think, accelerate your application development. There's lots to do this week still. This is only day 2. We have 2 more days. We're only halfway through Dreamforce. The one session I want to make you aware of is my colleagues Zane and Renee are on Friday going to be doing Be an Efficient Developer with Visual Studio Code. VS Code, I think, is the next thing that if you're going to knock off the command line, take a look at Visual Studio Code. It uses a command line, and we're adding some features in Winter 19 that make it easier to develop against sandboxes as well as scratch orgs. So check that out. And of course, don't forget the developer keynote tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Who's going? Woohoo! I'll be there too. Look for me. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found some tools, and I hope you have a fantastic Dreamforce.